All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We're really excited to be here with all of you tonight to celebrate Sim Kern's brand new novel, The Free People's Village. This book is from environmental journalist and founder of the hashtag trans rights readathon, Sim Kern. And it is a eat the rich climate fiction that you definitely will not want to put down. Sim is joined by Francis James Dinger, who is a friend of mine and fellow writer. They are a writer living in Seattle. Their work has appeared in Catapult, Identity Theory, the Seattle Review of Books, Volume 1 Brooklyn, and Two Serious Ladies, among other places. Francis is currently completing a nonfiction title for Boss Fight Books about utopianism and digital economies in a beloved video game franchise. And when I knew we were doing this event, I thought of them because their work in the fiction space sort of considers a lot of the issues that come up in Sim's work. In this novel, it's set in an alternate 2020 timeline. Al Gore won the 2000 election and declared a war on climate change rather than a war on terror. For 20 years, Democrats have controlled all three branches of government, enacting carbon-cutting schemes that never made it to a vote in our world. Green infrastructure projects have transformed U.S. cities into lush paradises for the wealthy white neighborhoods, at least. And the Bureau of Carbon Regulation levies carbon taxes on every financial transaction. But as we will come to know, not everything is as it seems, and that it's probably no surprise for our friends who are watching, who maybe are watching our real world play out and the Democrats' failures in our timeline. So part of what we wanted to ground this conversation is just the moment that we are living in. We're living in a very fraught moment. And part of the reason that we wanted you to come be here, initially when we extended this invitation, we wanted you to be our kickoff author for Trans Awareness Week. We were joking that we can never quite get the jargon around that right. As three trans folks, the corporatization of trans rebellion and remembrance and celebration is always a little hard for me. But I do want to honor our communities. And this book is important for that. And we're really glad for that. But also want to honor the fact that you have been doing a lot of really important work online around lifting up awareness of what is happening in Gaza, the fight for freedom in Palestine, and helping people, sort of bridge many different kinds of understandings as a Jewish person, as an anti-Zionist. And that's been the work that you've really been doing online the last many weeks since October 7th and really even before that. I'm also aware that for those of us who are based in Atlanta, today was a really important day in the Stop Cop City movement, which is at its core a movement based in indigeneity, in environmentalism, in the right of all of us to share land peacefully and lovingly and without fear of police violence and intervention and state violence. And your book is very much grounded in these ideas. So it just, I was joking that I wish in some ways that this was not so kismet, but it is. And so it's a great honor to have you here. It's a great honor to have so many of our folks and your folks from your platform join us tonight. I want to encourage folks, if you have questions, you can pop them in the Q&A box at any time. And Francis will incorporate them into the conversation as they see fit. But without further ado, thank you both so much for being here. Let's get on with the conversation.
Thank you, ER, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, Sim, for being in conversation with me. I love this book. It connects with so many. I think it's interesting to hear ER talk about his emotional connection with this book as in really how the themes relate to the Stop Cop City movement. I live near what was the Capitol Hill Occupied protest on Capitol Hill in Seattle during the pandemic. And so I saw a lot of similarities between the Free People's Village and CHOP. And I think anyone who has been involved in activism at any level who reads this book will recognize types of people that they've met. Anyone who hasn't been involved in activism, this book, the way it's structured, it really lays out kind of the baby activist journey to decolonizing their mind and finding the real ways to get involved. But we'll get to that later. I did want to start with talking about your online presence as an anti-Zionist Jewish person, especially given that we had a conversation before we started about how you were writing the end of the novel in 2021 during some increased violence against Palestinians, and incorporated some of your protest experience in the end of the novel. And so I thought we could start there.
Yeah, so I write chronologically. I write my books like beginning to end. And so I started this book in early 2021, in January of 2021, coming off of the experiences of 2020 and all of the Black Lives Matter movement and that I had been involved with that summer, moving into a fall where those protests were being really brutally cracked down upon by Democratic mayors, by our Democrat politicians. And at the same time, all of us leftists were being told by the Democratic Party leadership, like, sit down, shut up, vote for Joe Biden. And being like an anarchist at the time and already like very far to the left, like I didn't really have any hope that he was going to enact all of these like campaign promises that we got that were somewhat progressive and of course have not come to pass. So already, I think by early 2021, the very first days of his presidency, there's already like a major feeling of disillusionment. And so I wanted to write this book to show that, to take Democrats at their word and say, even in like an alternate timeline where Democrats had a super majority on power, when you couldn't blame your policy failures on Kristen Sinema and Joe Manchin or whoever the rotating villain is, neoliberalism would still let us down in terms of achieving the kind of free world that we want to see, in terms of ending police brutality and addressing climate change and all of these things we were calling for so loudly in 2020. And then I was kind of mostly done with the book when, there was a huge Palestinian uprising in 2021 following an outburst of Israeli violence. And in Houston, it was really powerful for me because I was carrying so much grief about the way the protests in our city and this revolutionary moment had been really brutally crushed in 2020. And it reminded me to my early baby activism days when Occupy was going on, Occupy Wall Street and Occupy Houston. And I was like a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed 22-year-old involved in my first protest movement. And seeing those things crushed was just so heartbreaking. And I was kind of reliving that again now in my 30s. But then when these Palestinian protests erupted in our city, it was really incredible. Like, the organizing was so powerful. And actually there was this protest, which I describe it. I really set the final scene of the book without any spoilers at a real protest that happened in Houston, where the Palestinian Youth Movement and Students for Justice in Palestine managed to block and take over all the roads surrounding the Galleria, which is the biggest mall in Houston. It's like the center of the most wealthy part of town. And I had lived in Houston for 15 years, but I had never seen anyone take those streets. Those streets are really hard to take over, and they did it. And it was this just beautiful day of families marching in solidarity for Palestine. And I had been unlearning Zionism. I had been supported Palestinian rights for a few years, but I had been vocal about it online, but I really committed myself to being an anti-Zionist Jew in that moment. I decided I wanted it to be like front and center in the book. I wanted to say from the river to the sea, like in the book, So that was a huge inspiration, and it really gave the book the hope that's there at the end, because when I started writing the book, I was feeling so hopeless about it. Was really just a book born from grief of when you've believed in a movement and fought so hard for it, and then all your friends who are like your bravest friends, have been arrested or injured or worse. How do you move on? And I wasn't really sure how I was going to end it until I think it was really those protests that inspired me with this idea of, every protest that you go to lays the foundation for the next one. Every bit of activism that you do is planting seeds, and you may never see those seeds sprout, but they're having an impact. So I really owed that to those Palestinian young organizers in Houston, and found them so inspiring. And that was why I put them in this book. And then since then, I just still try to show up for Palestine, how I can online, as an anti-Zionist like content creator who has a platform. It was really a no-brainer when October 7th happened. Like, I immediately was like, start reading books about Palestine. Like, y'all need to start learning and getting educated about this, because that was what shook me out of the sort of Zionism that I had been raised in and indoctrinated into, was reading just some books.
Yeah. And I want to come back to, in a minute, the parallels between you learning about anti-Zionism and the narrator Maddie kind of deconstructing some of her Catholic shame in the book. But I want to stay with the online element for a second. So your TikToks raising awareness around the ongoing genocide in Gaza have, many of them have gone fairly significantly viral, I would say. And there is also, in the novel, there's a lot of strategy that the activists talk about in what content they post, and trying to manipulate or take advantage of, or online cycles of virality and online attention. And I think one of the things that I really enjoyed about this book is, like, I think how online you are benefited the book, because it's so difficult to write about the internet in a way that doesn't immediately feel passe. And so I wanted to ask you, when you're making your content, how do you think about the attention cycle? And then by extension, how did you think about how you wanted to portray the internet in the novel?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how consciously I thought about it in the novel. It's just such a part of activism these days, isn't it? I mean, it just has to be. If you want people to come out to your events, you have to publicize them. I already feel like the book's a little dated, because so much of the organizing is on Twitter in the book, because this was before I wrote it, before Musk took over Twitter and the whole, the wheels started coming off of
future. So he didn't take Twitter in your book.
Yeah, now I think really TikTok and Instagram, especially with the stories, and I think Instagram is the most useful place that I see organizing happening in this particular moment. Although a lot of stuff is still happening on Twitter. Twitter's almost had a resurgence of a moment. It's felt more relevant in the last few weeks. But yeah, so I think it's just really, the writing about the internet is just reflected from my personal experiences with it. And like you said, like being chronically online. And what was the other part of the question? Like, as someone online, how do I think about meeting the moment? I just think when there's a horrific genocide happening, and it's happening like in your name, like as a US Jew, I've just decided it's really my responsibility to like speak out every single time there's an outbreak of violence against Palestinians. And yeah, so that's just what I do. And I've been doing it for years. The first time I created a Read for Palestine challenge was in 2021 when I was writing this book. And I just had a YouTube channel then. I wasn't on TikTok or Instagram. And I started this Read for Palestine challenge, and I got like 3 or 4 other YouTubers to do it with me. And we had a couple joint events, and I don't know, maybe 25 people participated. And just my platform has grown a lot since then. And this moment, I feel like, is again, all of that, all the organizing that Palestinians have done, that Jewish Voice for Peace has done, year after year after year, even when sometimes it's felt like no one's paying attention, the media is not paying attention, but we're still like showing up to meetings, continuing to say things, continuing to get organized. All of that sort of coalesces in a moment like this. And like, there's so much groundwork stretching back years that certain online content creators have done that helped create this like changing narrative that we're seeing now, where I do think that like a huge number of hearts and minds are being shifted on this issue, and that the narrative is being shifted when you see even a majority of Republicans supporting a ceasefire. I think that that's pretty huge.
Yeah, that is huge. And returning to the aspect of religion, so much of this book, the themes of religious shame and the ways in which Christianity specifically, because of the idea of sin and putting personal responsibility for salvation on the individual, that can really prevent people from taking meaningful collective action. There's a great scene toward the end of the novel where Shayna, one of the organizers of the Save the Eighth movement, visits Maddie while she's in inpatient treatment, where Maddie is kind of going through this shame spiral about how she felt personally responsible for some horrific events that happen that I won't reveal to avoid spoilers. But that shame spiral, to me as a former Catholic, felt very familiar. And so I was wondering if you could talk about your thought process for how your journey, like educating yourself on anti-Zionism, and then framing that in Maddie's journey as she's deconstructing her shame and from Christianity, and the way that has continued to impact her life even after her loss of faith.
Yeah, so I went to Catholic school for 3 years of high school. So I got some Catholic indoctrination. I had to take theology every year. And one of the things that I think the shame spiral is something that Jews and Catholics have in common, that the Protestants maybe don't experience in quite the same way.
Actually, my therapist has said something very similar.
Yeah. So that part of Catholicism felt like familiar to me. And I think the responsibility, and something that I did admire about there's obviously a lot of like Catholic school trauma in this book, but one thing I did admire was like our Catholic school like made us all do a lot of service. There's this idea of like, you have to, it's similar to the Jewish concept of tikkun olam, like you have to work to repair the world. Like you are not just for yourself, you must be for others. And so, I think that Maddie has clearly internalized that, and that's one of the positive things that she's taken from the Catholicism that she's sort of deconstructing in this book. But there's sort of a spotlight syndrome you can get on yourself, and I experience it now too, where you feel like the entire world is on your shoulders, and movement is about everyone working together. And so I just wrote this because I have this tendency, as I have in the last few weeks, of like, every single second feeling ashamed if I'm not doing something, resharing a story, forwarding something, calling a senator, like doing whatever it is. And just like even when I'm just taking breaks to fulfill basic bodily functions, and so I think that that's one of the themes of the book, is learning to work in community, learning that everyone is doing this lift together, learning to find balance, to do what you can to do. And then also that there are times when there's like a critical moment, which I think we're experiencing right now, where you have to give it your all. You have to make yourself uncomfortable and push, because something huge is happening, right? Like a sea change is happening, a protest movement is erupting. Like those are times that I think it's valuable. I think it's honorable to just kind of push yourself beyond definitely what you normally would. But also recognizing that like burnout is very real, that our collective liberation is a lifelong struggle, and you must make time to like take care of yourself, experience joy, like be in the moment, you know, like these are also essential so that you can sustain doing the work long term, because that is ultimately what is the most impactful thing, is when people get activated and can stay activated working on an issue for a very long time.
Yeah, and I think that leads into one of my next questions. So, Maddie is a cis white woman who is exploring her queerness, but still largely has a very privileged identity, and she finds herself enthralled in this movement that is largely led by people of color, trans people, and people who have experienced a lot more marginalization than she has. And part of her emotional journey throughout the book is learning to change how she reacts to some feedback that I would say that she receives from the people in the community that she's trying to become more of a part of. And I think she could have, as a kind of the well-meaning white woman character that she begins as, if she hadn't been able to receive feedback with humility, her emotional arc could have been a lot darker. And so how did you think about Maddie as a narrator, and when you were choosing how you were going to position her identity in contrast to the people around her?
Yeah, so I didn't want her to be a villain, but I also didn't want her to be. There's very much a binary in books about anti-racism, like fiction novels that take on social justice or anti-racism, whether written by white authors, certainly. Like in 2020 I was kind of looking around for books that were doing that in like a really nuanced way, but a lot of the books by white authors that take on these topics, there are really only two types of white characters. There is like a perfect white character, and then there's like really evil, racist, bad white characters that are like Klan members, or like very overtly racist, or like very much like betray the people of color around them. And I think that those two archetypes leave out a lot of people who are in the middle. And I think it's very difficult and scary to write about the people that are in the middle, because it involves revealing messiness and failures of solidarity on white people's part, which reflects maybe on the author. So, a lot of those books, just there's the white protagonist or whoever the white character is, who's not the evil, bad racist. It's kind of, they already sort of know everything already. They don't make any mistakes. They don't screw up. And that's really unrealistic to my experiences of deconstructing white supremacy. Is like, it's been a journey, and it means having humility and acknowledging when you fucked up, and sitting with feelings of shame when you realize you accidentally did a racism, or you have been carrying around biases that are really uncomfortable to talk about. Like, it is a messy, uncomfortable process. And I really haven't seen much writing by white authors that have been writing about that messy process with integrity and a lot of attention. So that's what I wanted to do. And that's why Maddie is the way she is. She's well-meaning. She wants to be a good person, but she's ultimately very naive when the book starts out, in ways that I was once naive. I was raised in a very majority white part of the country. I was raised in rural Illinois. So there was a lot when I moved to Houston, which is like the most diverse city in the country, that I had to learn in a very short amount of time in order to be an effective teacher in a majority non-white school, with a friend group, in a community of people who are like all different races and all different ethnicities. and part of that involves screwing up and then taking accountability for that and learning. And not all white people do it well. Like, it's not, a lot of white people don't ever get past their white fragility and don't really learn or change or unpack those things. But there's a lot of people who are somewhere on the stage of an anti-racist journey, and I hope that this book would find people wherever they are and help them recognize, hold up a mirror and help white readers recognize themselves somewhere on that journey, and maybe even have a little compassion for themselves. Because something that I see is white activists who are really eager to pounce on shame, put on blacklists, people who are not as far along on their anti-racist journey as them, a lot of the dogpiling that you see online. There's very little compassion or mercy to that. And there's a great article by Anush Jajorian for a few years ago that talks about how those white people are really appropriating the anger of people of color. And it's actually much more effective as a white ally to it's our job to gather in white people who are not, as with it as we are, and help educate them and have that patience and that calmness and meet them where they are and have those difficult conversations. Just as now I'm trying to have those types of conversations with Jews who are maybe questioning the Zionism that they've grown up with, right? So that takes a level of patience and calm, and not just calling people out and shaming them. So those were the types of conversations that I hoped the character of Maddie would inspire.
Yeah, and I think that definitely comes through because it's so much of dogpiling and shame or canceling people. It's just a replication of carceral punishment in the social sphere. And I really loved the evolution of Maddie's relationship with Shayna, who is a Black activist who's leading the Save the Eighth movement. At the beginning of the novel, Maddie makes a very big gaffe, to say the least, in front of Shayna at an activist meeting, and carries the shame of that moment throughout the entire book. And it's really not, I think it's maybe in the last 30 pages of the novel where Maddie finally realizes that Shayna is actually her friend. And that felt real, and also so sad that they had been doing work together for a year, and Maddie didn't realize that doing the work is forming a friendship, and that Shayna didn't give Maddie a pass, but recognized that she was someone that was ultimately well-meaning and could be given some great.
She keeps showing up.
Yeah.
And that's the key thing about Maddie is even when she's embarrassed herself, even when she's fucked up, she keeps showing up. She keeps trying.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the productive ways that she used some of her Catholic shame, because the fear of her own feelings of shame if she didn't show up were sometimes her only motivator for showing up. But she was still in the room, and as I think it was very realistic. Unfortunately, the number of protests in the book where fewer than a dozen people show up, I think you do a great job of portraying the cycle of activism as there, and Shayna has a moment of dialogue toward the end of the book where she's talking about activism as kind of a mycelium network, where it's the roots of the mushrooms underground and popping up, and then big activism events are the fruiting bodies, the mushrooms that you see above ground. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought. But I guess the point of that was to say that I think so many fiction writers who try to portray activism in fiction, it's either a fear of showing the boring parts of it, or maybe people who haven't been involved in activism writing activism. It's so often glamorized as all about the big protest, but Maddie, despite being the main character, is not the main character of the movement. Like there are a lot of scenes of her just like chopping vegetables to make sure everyone gets fed at the Three People's Village. She is like cleaning the space that that everyone is occupying. I think that's a really interesting model to offer other white authors, to show you can write a main character who's the main character of their own story, who's not the main character of the event that they're participating in.
Right, because the last thing I wanted to do was have Maddie be like a white savior character, right?
Right.
I love this. And I wanted to write, I think any kind of savior narrative is rooted in capitalist, white supremacist myths. Like, it's just not, I wanted to write a more communal style story. And the plot of the book is being moved forward by a whole group of people. And so, yes, you have the positionality of like one character's point of view, but they don't have to be the architect of the plot in a way, they can, Maddie has her own emotional arc. She has her own stakes. She has her own projects. She has to overcome her own challenges. But like you said, she's not like the main character of the movement.
And then I think another thing that is done very wonderfully in this book is, there are many characters in this book, and it is difficult as a writer to juggle a lot of characters and make sure that they all feel real and not stereotypes of their identities. And I was curious if you could tell us a little bit about your thought process in showing Maddie's education as she's like talking to indigenous people of indigenous tribes in Texas, who she had been told by the Texas public school system were extinct, is the term that was used, which is dehumanizing, and also Maddie learns is incorrect. And then she gets a crash course in the history of Black activism in America from one of her bandmates, Justice. And there are all of these moments of education that could have felt prescriptive, but they all felt like very real conversations. And so if you could talk about that kind of on the craft level and then on the human level, about how you thought about showing those conversations in the text.
Yeah. And I'm very interested in ideas. And I also, there's a lot of different, there's communists and anarchists and socialists in the book. And I was really like, part of writing the book is like figuring out how I feel about all of those things. So they're, in a way, conversations I was having with myself, and also obviously conversations that I'd had in movement spaces with friends of mine over the years. So some of it is just like, I think some people have read the book, there's some people who've written in reviews that they felt like it was too much theory and, heavy-handed ideas. There's a distaste for didactic literature in the US that goes back to the CIA involvement with creative writing programs in the 1950s. But I have a whole TikTok about that if you want to watch it. But I'm interested in ideas. I'm interested when different activists are like debating leftist praxis. Like those are conversations I enjoy. So I wrote them into the book. And so it's very much like just a natural reflection of like communities I've been in and the way that we talk to each other. And if it sounds to some people like lecturing or something, or like too didactic, it's like, well, that's kind of how movement space is.
Right. Have didactic conversations in real life.
And we talk about ideas and strategy. For sure. So like, I remember I actually went to New York I was involved in Occupy Houston. Obviously we had like a lot of those conversations at Occupy Houston. And then I remember I was so in love with Occupy Wall Street, and I wanted to go to Zuccotti Park. So I like arranged like meet a friend in New York, and I actually showed up like 2 days or something after the police had smashed the encampment and like it had all sort of fallen apart, but people were still gathering in Zuccotti Park every day for a people's muster. Or no, that's what it's called in my book. What was it called in real life? I always forget. I replaced it in my head. Was it a General Assembly? Maybe.
That sounds right.
So, and I went to one and I just hung out after and like ended up staying till like 2 a.m, just like talking to people I was meeting there in, on the streets, about what they thought of the movement and where we should be going and what we should be doing. And, so that was just like such a cool formative moment. And I was like 21, I think, when that happened. So like very close to Maddie's age. So yeah. What was the question about? Oh yeah. Just, I think those conversations are just a reflection of like how I learned some of these things. And in the book, I mentioned some of the books that I read to develop my sort of worldview and outlook. So there's like a whole reading list attached to the book if you want to dive deeper and learn more.
Yeah, and that actually relates to some of the things that are coming through in chat. So Stephen said, not a question, but love that you provided a reading list within the text. I ended up with a copy of Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Thanks. And then Irene asks, who is your favorite character to write?
Ooh, probably, I mean, it was really fun. So, Red and Lorenzo are sort of both loosely based on the friends of mine that the book is dedicated to, who died within a year of each other. And I didn't try to write the characters like exactly like them. They're not supposed to be them. They have different lines of extras, but I kind of gave them some of their energy, I guess, those characters. And so it was actually very like wonderful and healing throughout most of the book to be writing those characters and like feeling like I was like getting to spend time with them again almost. So I really cherish that. And it was writing this book was like part of processing my grief. I think that like writing Maddie embarrassing herself and fucking up in ways that I've fucked up in the past was kind of fun and funny. I enjoy self-deprecating humor. So I think that was like very funny to me. Like the screw up that you mentioned that she has early in the book, that was very fun for me to write. Yeah, so I think, and I just love all the scenes, the scenes where everybody's hanging out and everything's good, like the snow day scene, where the dialogue was just like coming very naturally, and it just really felt like these characters were very alive in my head in the way they talked to each other and interacted. That was really fun.
Yeah, the snow day scene, that's one of my favorites. And it's because it's so sweet and like, but then also tragic. Like so many of the scenes like have both of those emotional realities in them. There's the joy with the grief because Justice is essentially under a dystopian version of house arrest and can't leave the porch to participate in frolicking in the twice in a lifetime snow, which is sad, but I can imagine also maybe like Justice did at least get the benefit of watching his friends enjoy it. But yeah, related to the grief. So you are a journalist and activist and you're writing socially conscious fiction. That is, and being aware of how the world is in reality, and then writing speculative fiction that reflects possible worlds, but also worlds in which we haven't completely deconstructed systems of oppression. That's just a lot of grief to live with. What is your personal approach to finding ways to still imagine hopeful futures in spite of being immersed in the grief of our world in many different avenues of your life? I hope that's not too heavy of a question.
Oh yeah, I sometimes have to be pushed. So actually my editor, one of the best, I have an incredible editor for this book, Renee Vasquez, and one of their edits their like editorial notes on the book was that I needed to make the ending less bleak, significantly less bleak. Like there had to be more hope there. And I'm really glad that they pushed me to do that because it's a much stronger book for it. And I think that that is the right ending for this book. It just, like I said, sometimes I need to be pushed to be a little less cynical and to continue seeing the hope. And I think that's also something that I realized as someone with with this platform now, which has really exploded over the last few days, is like, where I can't, like something I've been trying to do is like showing how Palestinian books have been showing up on bestseller lists. Like, can I find anything hopeful to keep people going, knowing that people are experiencing growing fatigue, speaking out and feeling like no one's listening? Like we kind of you have a kind of responsibility as an author or like any kind of activist who's in any kind of leadership position or that people look up to, which I think as a content creator, you like inherently are, to try to, I don't know, keep morale up, but without being fake and bullshitty and like toxic positivity and not allowing people to like feel their grief. And so I wanted this book to do all of those things. It was a huge like repository of grief, like I said, not just like for some people that I lost in my personal life in the year before I wrote this, but also that grief of like when you believe in a movement and the movement is like violently oppressed by the state and it feels like maybe there's some sort of change that's going to happen, but then no, you're living through the backlash and everything's getting 10 times worse, and police budgets are just expanding because of all that marching we did. That's tough shit. And that brings up some big feelings. So, yeah, kind of just balancing the being honest about that, allowing people to have their feelings, but also trying to find those like glimmers of hope. I find so much hope in storytelling, obviously. And you are also, you write like some solar punk type stuff, right?
Yeah, sort of. I mostly have published nonfiction, but yes, I have a novel in progress that could be described as solar punk.
So, and solar punk imagines optimistic futures because we're not going to get our way out of capitalism if we can't even imagine a better world. And like the first step is in imagining these types of things. So I do see hope. I see hope in shifting narratives. I see hope. Obviously it is like too late to have hope for tens of thousands of Palestinians possibly who have lost their lives. We don't know really what the death toll is right now. But there is, so I don't want to like be like, oh, like so hopeful, but there is a kind of hope in the US in the way I do think narratives are meaningfully changing, in the way that social media is allowing truth to reach masses of people in a way that before social media, it wasn't possible to disseminate any kind of information on a wide scale that contradicted imperialist narratives. So like, I find hope in social media. I find hope in the explosion of queer literature, even though we're living through a major backlash to the queer literature explosion of the last 10 years. And there's book bannings and everything. There's still so much more queer literature out there than there was 10 years ago, just in terms of what's on the shelves, what's being published. Like, I don't think that's a genie you can put back in the bottle, so I gather a lot of hope from that as well. So it's not a naive hope. I'm not one of those people who's like, the arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I think that's bullshit. I think like you always must be fighting and dragging it where you want it to go. And always we will be resisting the forces of fascism and greed and, domination. But I think, I find a lot of hope in storytelling.
And despite the backlash against the rise in queer literature, this is a USA Today bestseller. You had mentioned a moment ago about your editor, Wendy Vasquez, helping push you toward a more hopeful ending of the book. I think that dovetails nicely into the question around So it takes a lot of people to sustain an activist movement. It also takes a lot of people to make a book. And I was wondering if you could tell us about the experience of working with the graphic designer to think through the cover, because if anyone hasn't seen the book in person, if the dust jacket unfolds into a protest poster, which is really neat, and then the interior cover, it looks like a album cover for the band that the main characters play in the book. And then also the end pages are kind of a map of the Free People's Village. And it's such a fun object. Did you get a chance to collaborate with the designer? Where did the ideas for the book as an object originate?
Yeah, so, and I want to make clear, because I want to give everybody credit. So the person we call the book designer is Jonathan. Oh my God. Okay, I'll look at his last name. His first name is Jonathan. Renee maybe is in the chat. I can put it in the Q&A what his last name is. But he does the interior. The designer is like does the interiors and like the fonts and everything. But the cover artist was Ganzir, who's an Egyptian artist, but he ended up moving to Houston. So he's got a really cool story. Hold on, let's in the chat. Jonathan Yamakami. Yeah, sorry. He was our wonderful designer. And Ganzir did the cover art and the case and the end papers. And I requested him. So I knew of his art back from 2011 when Occupy was going on, and I was like so involved in that. Well, obviously that movement was inspired by the Arab Spring, which was taking place all across the Middle East. And one of the countries that experienced a revolution that spring, which was inspiring people in the US to try for some sort of revolutionary activity, was the Egyptian Revolution. And his art was, he did some street art from it that became so iconic. Like every news story coming out about events in Cairo that spring would often feature like his artwork and his mural somewhere in the story. And so then like years later in Houston, I was like, at Zine Fest, I was like connecting with Zine Fest. I did some stuff with Zine Fest Houston, and I was putting together like a package of artists on the Gulf Coast who like do stuff around like solar punk and climate change and stuff. And I realized that this now Houston-based artist was the same Ganzir who had done this incredible street art during the Egyptian Revolution. And so what happened was he ended up, the revolution was betrayed by the military. There was a military coup after this successful, peaceful People's Revolution. He continued to criticize the military regime through his art, ended up getting doxxed on public national television, and like accused of being a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, basically like named an enemy of the state. And so that coincided with a trip. He was in New York and he stayed in the US he had to stay in the US for a long time. After that, ended up settling in Houston. So I just thought like he was the coolest. We ended up like connecting on like another project. And I was like, always like, I want Ganzir to do a cover of one of my books. And then as I was writing this book, I was like, I want Ganzir to do the cover of this book because his art would be so perfect. Because it has that like street art, occupation feel. So I requested him, and luckily my editor, Livia Credo, who I already named, was like very on board with the idea of working with him. And I was so honored, like he actually read the entire book. That's very unusual for a cover artist to actually like read. Usually they get like a synopsis, but he read the whole book. And so he put all these like Easter eggs into the art that he made for it, which is just like so cool. So yeah, and actually I'll plug on Friday of this week, he and I are having a talk hosted by Basket Books and Art at the same time as Right Now. So people want to hear more about his story and his thoughts that went into designing it. Come to that event.
That's awesome. Yeah, I have that on my calendar. And I love that you got to have the artist that you wanted to do the cover design. That is a very rare experience in publishing. And I think maybe was made possible in part by the fact that you worked with an indie publisher. And what was that choice like choosing to publish with an indie publisher versus seeking a more traditional publisher?
Yeah, well, I was actually between agents when this is getting in kind of the weeds of like publishing business, but I was between agents. I had just left my former agent when I was, I had just finished this book and I was querying agents. That's when you're like pitching agents to try to get an agent who will then try to sell your book to a publisher. And actually, I was participating in a pitching contest on Twitter, just like you put a one tweet pitch of your book and then agents can respond. Well, this editor from Livy and Corrido, who remembered me from a previous submission, Irene, was like, hey, send me your book. And like, I'm really interested. So I knew Livy and Corrido was an independent press, but I also knew they're one of the much larger independent presses. They have a really good infrastructure. They work through Chronicle is their distributor, which is like a major distributor. So I had worked with other much smaller indie presses on my previous books. And I was really excited about the prospect of working with Livy and Corrido, and Irene ended up making an offer on the book that was a really great offer. It was a great advance. It was a great, plan. Like all along, I've just absolutely loved the experience of working with them because working with a smaller publisher, working with an editor who has a small list, like I felt so important and taken care of, and like they really care about my book. It's not just like one of 50 that this company is throwing onto the market in a season, to see which one sinks or swims. It's really felt like so much care and attention has been put into this book, and everyone at, on the team at Livy and Corrido and Chronicle has been really behind it. So I've had a very, very positive experience working with them.
That's great. And so I do want to remind everyone that there is 8 minutes, now 7 minutes left in the event. So if there are any other questions, pop them in chat. And I wanted to save time to ask you about what you're currently working on. It sounds like your next project is a little outside of your usual realm of solar punk and speculative or near future sci-fi.
Yeah, so I'm finishing up. I'm on the last chapters of a book of historical fiction set in the 17th century, about a group of queer Jews traveling around Europe, set in the Holy Roman Empire, Italy, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And it's very relevant in a way, in a way, it's a continuation from everything I've done before, because in speculative fiction and sci-fi, I've been writing about climate change. I've been writing about white supremacy and racism and social justice and queer identity and queer survival. And those are all themes in this book, because those were all problems in 17th century Europe. For queer Jews in 17th century Europe who definitely existed. But, I'm imagining some into existence. And so I did a ton of research about what was going on at the time. And just on all the parallels to what's going on, trying to show like how the foundations of like environment, even take something like climate change and like environmental destruction. In the 17th century, you have concerns of overpopulation because Europe has run out of trees and is having to switch to burning coal. The rivers are all full of shit. And so nobles are starting to buy bottled water from hot springs in the mountains. Like all of these concerns that we think, so there were thinkers talking about already, like, have we overpopulated the world at a time when there were only 1 million people? So all of these concerns that we feel like are very now and apocalyptic and recent are actually stretching back 400 years. And I think it's also feels very relevant to me, right? I was feeling a little disconnected from it over the past month until my agent reminded me that something that this book is doing is disrupting simplistic narratives about Jewish history that are like simplistic, just victim-only narratives, that Jews were always victims, that we never were complicit in evil systems and oppression. And that's not true. That's not true when it comes to like Jewish slave owners in the Ottoman Empire. That's not true when it comes to sometimes like Jewish treatment of Romanis in Europe. And so this book is trying to sort of complicate all that history and show all that nuance, or even in the way the Jewish communities treated their own queer members or women in their societies. And so it's a book that is seeking to disrupt very simplistic ideas that we have about the Renaissance, you know, when this book is set. And it's also, I think, a corner of Jewish history that just not a lot of people know about, period. I mean, people skip right to the Pale of, you know, there's some fiction, a lot of fiction about the biblical times, and there's a lot of fiction about the Pale of the Settlement and the Holocaust, but not this this particular chunk of time. So I was really interested in exploring all of that with this book.
Well, I can't wait to read it. There's a new question in chat. M says, I was born in a family practicing Hinduism staunchly. I'm an atheist now, but my journey into rejecting what I grew up with was not easy at all. I'm curious, how did you become an anti-Zionist, given how much Zionism has been embedded into the Jewish identity?
Yeah, I was lucky because my immediate family was not Zionist, but was sort of like when I was growing up, you know, they've kind of come along with me on, you know, this anti-Zionist journey, which I'm very lucky for, my immediate family. But the people around us, a lot of them were committed Zionists or like extended family members. And also just definitely got the, like, it's complicated. It's two sides. It's a religious war. It's just religions hating each other. That sort of thing, which is not accurate. So I didn't understand Israel as like a settler colonial state until I was much older and really into my 30s. And it was reading, I was reading books. It's starting with Palestine by Joe Sacco, which is a graphic novel that I still recommend all the time to people. It's like sold out everywhere right now, but it's so great because the graphic novel is like such a, I feel like a good, easy entry. Like you can read it so quickly. And I really think that book should be like held alongside Mouse as like two exemplary novels of historical graphic novel in that medium. So yeah, reading that book was really the thing that just made me realize for the first time, hey, it's not that complicated. It's not two sides. And actually, I think that book kind of does what the Free People's Village does, in that the main character, well, it's journalism, but the journalist goes to Palestine expecting to find one narrative, you know, with one set of biases and preconceptions. And over the course of his real conversations with Israelis and Palestinians, he comes to understand the reality of the apartheid and the settler state. So that, starting with that book and then just committing to continuing to read Palestinian voices so that I can learn more and more over time.
Thank you. And ER has put the link to that book in the chat on Charis's website. It is sold out, but order and get on the waiting list. So there is one more question in chat that I think is a good one to close with before I turn it back over to ER to talk about how people can buy this book. But Rachel in chat asks if you have any advice for an aspiring baby activist who is getting into activism spaces like Maddie, as well as someone who wants to be a teacher who's worried about future job opportunities if they post about their activism.
Yeah, so, and that's a real concern, right? That I write about in the book, that political activism, like teachers can really face repercussions for that. So one thing you can do is you can be active in person, because your school district probably isn't going to find out about that, as long as you practice good, sort of like if you're going to a major protest, like practice good security measures, like wear a mask, you know, don't take selfies of yourself there, you know. You can also do a lot of like behind the scenes organizing with a local social justice group, like types of things that like Maddie does in the book towards the end, where she's taking more of like a clerical role. Like she's a note taker. Be a note taker at your local, you know, if not now group or whatever it is that you join. Or Sunshine, what is it? The kids, the climate change kids, Sunshine Movement. Is that it? Anyways, whatever your group is, you know, pick a group that matches your passions and your identity, and where you think you'd be worthwhile, and do what you can for them. But then if you want to be involved online as a it's tricky to be online if you're going to be a teacher and you think, you're going to be in a school district where you might face repercussions. But there's people who do a lot of stuff online using an avatar, like big accounts. Like, you don't have to put your real name. You can have an avatar picture and be like reposting all the stuff, just have like a secret Twitter where you can say what you want and build a platform and boost voices that you care about, and just don't use your name, and practice good digital security. So that'd be my advice.
Thank you. This has been a great conversation. I really appreciate getting a chance to talk to you about this book.
Yeah, this was great.
Village, purchase it from Charis Books. ER, if you want to come back on to sign us out.
Well, Frances, you've done my job for me. Thank you.
I didn't have to sell anything on your pre-event chat, but I guess I just did it anyway.
Well, this conversation certainly, I am sure, has piqued everyone's interest. If you don't already have a copy of The Free People's Village, you just click this teal button at the bottom of the screen and you can buy it. We would love for you to do that. It really does help us when you buy event books from us. The other thing we always encourage you to do is to request the book from your local public library. It really does help yourself and other people, for public libraries to know that this is the kind of book that you would like to see in your local public library, especially for those of us who are here in Georgia. We hear from librarians all the time that the will of the people really does matter. So that's it's a little baby activist step you could take. And it's a thing that also supports teachers. So, get books into public places so that the risk is dispersed for teachers and they can send kids to the public library to read. I just want to thank you, Sim, for all of your work. You are clearly convicted, but you are carrying a heavy load. And so thank you for what you are doing. You are modeling how to be an engaged artist for a lot of people. And I think that means that lots of baby artists and activists are going to spring up. So I think you're planting a lot of seeds, and you may not see them germinating yet, but I do believe that they are going to spring up. I am an optimist, but I do believe in that. So thank you for your work. It means a lot. And Frances, thank you for this beautiful interview. You did a wonderful job. So I appreciate you being here. And thanks everybody for joining us from around the US, and some folks internationally even joined us tonight. So we really appreciate you being with us. We know there's a lot of ways you could spend your time. If you would like to, if there's people that you wish had been here tonight, this event will be up on YouTube in a couple days. You can share it then. We would love for you to do that, and make sure that other folks can see this. But until next time, thanks y'all. Stay safe and well, and keep fighting the good fight. All right, bye.
Bye.